Hey everyone, today is a long time coming. For so long, we have dreamt about the opportunity for Brad and I to do the teaching series together, and I am thrilled to formally announce that Brad Nelson is jumping in as part of the teaching series here at Walking the Text. And Brad and I first met 20 years ago in college. We were roommates. We've been best of friends ever since. And to many of you, Brad Nelson is not a new face. He's been part of our Infusion Bible Conference faculty for the last several years. He has served for the last year as our full-time content director here at Walking the Text. And over the last 20 years, we've had the chance to work on a ton of different projects together. And so it's been years of conversation about eventually getting him on to Walking the Text to be able to begin leading trips and to be able to do teaching series and, a number of different speaking engagements, basically for the two Brads to have an opportunity to do the things that we love around the biblical text and to be able to do it together. And today is the first teaching that he's going to be jumping in with the teaching series. And so I wanted to formally introduce him to you, and I know he's just going to share a few words before he jumps into his teaching today.
Hey, I am so excited to be joining the teaching series. Like you, I love this guy. I love the teaching series. I've been following along for years, and as he said, we've been doing this work for 20 years and just itching for a way to do it in a more kind of formal way together. So I'm pumped and can't wait to dive in with you.
And speaking of diving in, this is part 2 of Characters of Christmas. And as Brad and I were working through the series together and talking through who's gonna take what, he's like, ooh, I want Mary, because Mary is an amazing character. Of course, we all know that, but what you're gonna hear from him today is gonna bring a whole new depth and understanding to your understanding of the Christmas story as we dig in to Mother Mary.
I don't know what you think about when you think of Mary, the mother of Jesus, but for me, and I know for many others, it brings to mind images like this. It's a delicate, very pregnant Mary riding uncomfortably on a donkey. And of course, if you watched part 1 of this mini-series, you know that they weren't wealthy enough to afford a donkey, but this is what comes to mind for many of us. Or maybe you think of Mary hovering over baby Jesus at the nativity, and of course, Jesus has this glow. Or maybe you have in mind a more traditional Mary holding the baby Jesus. Whatever comes to mind for you, these tend to be more traditional, sentimental images, which is fine. But when you start to put Mary in context, something completely different begins to emerge. You see a Mary who is anything but shy or meek. In fact, I love the way New Testament scholar Scott McKnight puts it. He says this about Mary. Mary was not a nice girl. Mary was a muscular, wiry woman whose eyes were aglow with a dazzling hope for justice and whose body evoked a robust confidence in the God who was about to turn the world upside down through her son. So when you think Mary, you need to be thinking spinal fortitude. You need to be thinking strength, courageousness. This is the Mary of the Jesus story. And so what I want to do is I just want to show you 2 little details that come out of her conversation with the angel Gabriel that help us to put her in her context and see Mary for the courageous young woman that she is. So let's dive right into Luke chapter 1, verses 26 through 27, where we read this. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth to, and then we get this word, a virgin. And this is an important word because it helps us kind of put a timestamp on Mary's life, because young girls in Mary's culture were married off usually between the ages of 13 and 15. So just let that sink in for a moment. already this is an entirely different image of Mary than what most of us conjure to our minds when we think of her. But when you go in deeper to what's happening in this text, you see, yes, that Mary is engaged, but it's actually a more formal word called that she's betrothed. And being betrothed or engaged in the first century was way more formal then than it is in our world now. When I asked my father-in-law for my wife's hand in marriage, he jumped up out of his chair, ran to his office, and got her file folder of student loans and brought it back to me and said, "She's all yours." And that was it. We were engaged. But that's not exactly how it unfolded in Mary's world. The betrothal process was very deliberate, very specific, and far more formal. And so I just want to show you how that betrothal process would unfold. First, that the betrothal process was arranged by the parents, but it was arranged with the couple's consent. So it wasn't like this was happening against their will. And as we talked about, Mary is somewhere between the ages of 13 and 15. And Joseph, if this is his first marriage, he's probably somewhere between the ages of 17 and 19. Now, there is maybe the possibility that Joseph is a widower and this is not his first marriage, in which case he might be a little older. We're not sure, but these are the typical ages for, young people who are getting married for the first time. But once that arrangement is made, they then enter into a much more formal part of the betrothal process that is initiated with what's called a ketubah. And a ketubah just kind of outlines, hey, here are the groom's responsibilities to this bride, but it also makes provisions for the bride price and the dowry. Now, the bride price is actually, it's not that Joseph is purchasing Mary, right? Like we're trading horses here. It's actually a much more honoring concept that says, I know that by marrying your daughter and bringing her under my authority, that you are going to be losing a valued member of your home. And so I'm going to compensate you for your loss. So that's the bride price. The dowry is what Mary would bring to the marriage from her family. And this was just a price that would help to provide for Mary if anything were to happen for Joseph, if Joseph were to die, or if somehow they were to be divorced, that Mary has something that she can live off of that serves as a protection for her. And so this is the second step in the betrothal process. And it's considered as legally binding. So once you have gotten to the ketubah stage, you are considered in the eyes of your Jewish community husband and wife. And that relationship can only be dissolved by death or divorce. Now, what's interesting that you see unfold in this betrothal process is that usually it lasted about a year. And in Galilee in particular, there was no unchaperoned time. There was no intimacy between the groom and his bride. Now, it was a little different in Judea, but in Galilee, it's a much more conservative environment. And so you don't get any alone time together. And that's for a reason, because they didn't want any unexpected pregnancies. Now, this betrothal process, when it got to the end of this year, would be followed by a second phase of what was called the wedding celebration. And this would start with a procession, right? Joseph and his groomsmen would leave his father's home and would travel to Mary's father's home to collect his bride and bring her back to his father's home where he had prepared a room. And then they would commence this 7-day wedding celebration. Now, it's not always 7 days, but it's a lot longer than what you and I are familiar with in our culture. So they carry out this 7-day wedding celebration, and a huge part of that is the very first night of the marriage. Mary and Joseph would go into a bridal chamber where the marriage would be consummated, and followed the next morning with a very ancient, very awkward process of bringing out the blood-stained cloth to show the wedding guests, to prove her virginity, and to really sustain and celebrate her honor. So you see that there's this very technical, very coordinated and orchestrated betrothal process. And what's so interesting about that is it actually shows us exactly where Mary is at in the betrothal process when she gets this news that she's pregnant. So when you look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 18, it says, "Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way, when his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph," or betrothed, "but before they lived together." So Mary has received her ketubah. She's in this 1-year process where she and Joseph are not allowed to have any contact. And suddenly she's found to be pregnant. And this puts Mary in a very difficult situation. Because if Mary is found to be pregnant, in the eyes of her community, she's going to be seen as an adulteress. And in a Torah-observant Jewish community, the Torah says in Deuteronomy 22 what to do with those who commit adultery. If there is a young woman, a virgin already engaged to be married, and a man meets her in the town and lies with her, you shall bring both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. Now, this isn't what happens to Mary, but I wonder if for half a second this flashes in front of her mind. I mean, adultery was very, very serious in her culture. In fact, Jewish and Roman law both required divorce for adultery. But even though the Torah talks about death by stoning, by the time Mary is being betrothed to Joseph in the first century, that's not something that's practiced. In fact, Craig Keener is this brilliant New Testament theologian, says that in New Testament times, Joseph would have merely been required to divorce Mary and expose her to shame. Now, you think to yourself, oh, okay, well, good. This is better for Mary. She's not dying. She's not being stoned to death. Her life is going to be spared. She's only going to experience shame. The problem is Mary and Joseph live in what's called an honor and shame culture. And in an honor and shame culture where your worth and your value is bound up with how other people perceive you, public shame was worse than death. And Gabriel's announcement means that the best case scenario for Mary is that she is divorced from Joseph. She's seen in the eyes of her community as an adulteress, and she goes home to live in her father's home for the rest of her life under the stigma of adultery. And this is just awful. Now, you and I know, because we have the benefit of hindsight, that Joseph is not going to expose her to shame, that Joseph is a righteous man and he's going to divorce her quietly. And we're not actually going to be talking about Joseph in this series. And the reason for that is that Brad already touched on Joseph and the implications of all of this on Joseph's life in a previous mini-series called The Genealogy Christmas. And you can find that at episode 46, Son of Joseph. And Brad also did a much longer teaching going into the details of all of this stuff and Joseph's perspective and what this would have meant for them. And you can find this in the sermon library on our website, and we'll actually link to it in the show notes so you can have access to that. But we know Joseph isn't going to expose Mary to shame. But when Mary has this conversation with Gabriel, she doesn't know that. All she knows is that the word of the Lord has the potential to make her life very, very difficult. And that's what makes what she says next so stunning. Because her response, her words, knowing all of this that we've just talked about, is this: "Here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." And then the angel departed from her. Now, I wanted you to see these specific words, and which is why I use the NRSV translation, because many translations, when they do this verse, they actually don't have "here am I." They cut that out. And the reason they do that is they're translating this Greek word called idu, and it's a particle, it's like a descriptor that literally means look or behold. So most translations just say, look, behold, I am the Lord's servant. But the reason I wanted to show you the RSV is because idu is actually connected to this Hebrew word, hineni. And if you look into the Hebrew scriptures, wherever you find the word hineni, it's often used by someone who's answering a divine summons. You see this specifically in Exodus chapter 3, when God calls out to Moses. It says, when the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And how does Moses respond? He says, hineni. Here I am. You see this with Abraham. You see this with the prophet Samuel. You see this with Isaiah over and over again. When God shows up in human history and he wants to act in a redemptive way, but he's looking for a partner to join him in the process, God is looking for people whose response is hineni. Here I am. I am up for the challenge. I am willing to go along with you, God, whatever the risks, whatever the danger, sign me up. I love the way Rabbi Joel Nickerson says this about the word hineni. He says, hineni means I am present. I am ready to fill in the blank. It's a bold statement that our forefathers used in moments of significant transition, fear, or what comes next. Hineni is about being present on the precipice of change. So you've got Mary, this 13 to 15-year-old little girl, and the angel Gabriel shows up with this announcement that has really world-shattering implications for her life. And her courageous response is, here I am. I am up for this no matter the risk. And actually, it's this courageous consent from Mary that makes many people see her as a model of discipleship. She is up for the challenge. She is up to be faithful to whatever activity God is calling her into, no matter the risk, no matter the cost. And here's what I love about this phrase, that God is always and everywhere trying to be born in our midst, but that God is waiting for people to have the presence of mind and the courageous spirit to say, here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word. I think we celebrate Christmas because Mary had the courage to say, here I am. And I think you could say that hope is born where people say, here I am. So there you have it, friends. That's Mary and her courageous consent. I hope you see her in a totally different light, this strong, wiry, muscular woman that she is. And may these words, here I am, be true of you this Christmas season. May they be true of me. And as we always say here at Walking the Text, may you walk out the text well in your life.